Peace talks are set to take place to end the Russia-Ukraine war, mediated by the US. However, Ukraine and other European countries are not being included in the discussions, which are scheduled to be held in Saudi Arabia. This has raised concerns among European nations. This situation reminds us of the Yalta Conference. In 1945, after World War II, the leaders of the three major Allied powers, US President Franklin Roosevelt, UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, met in the city of Yalta in Crimea. During this conference, agreements were made on the post-war reorganization of Europe, which were criticized by European nations at the time. Because the three major Allied powers unilaterally decided Europe's borders, governance, and spheres of influence without consulting the European countries directly affected by these decisions. For example, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Baltic states fell under Soviet influence, while Germany was partitioned into separate zones. The major powers made decisions based on their strategic interests, disregarding the interests and voices of the European nations involved. Now, after 80 years, in 2025, European countries are witnessing something similar happening again. In the peace talks set to take place in Saudi Arabia, Russia and the US will be present, but Ukraine and other European countries will not have a seat at the table. Their concern is that in such discussions, where important decisions related to the security of not just Ukraine but all of Europe will be made, Russia and US will prioritize their strategic interests. In a way, they will impose their decisions on Europe. Ukraine has already stated that it will not accept any peace agreement without its direct participation or consent. In response, the US has said that European countries are not being sidelined from the peace process. These are initial talks, meant only to determine whether Russia is serious about peace. Once Russia's sincerity is confirmed, Ukraine and European nations will be included in key negotiations in the future. Nevertheless, European countries are not happy with this. Feeling excluded from these discussions, they held an emergency summit in Paris. Countries such as the UK, Germany, Italy, Poland, and Spain participated, along with officials from the European Union and NATO. During the summit, security guarantees for Ukraine were discussed, and European countries worked together to prepare a unified response. European nations do not agree with the US stance on the peace process. According to them, the US is taking a soft approach toward Russia, which will ultimately undermine European interests. European countries are thinking this way because a shift is being seen in the US stance toward NATO and Europe. Look at the recent comments coming from the US. It is unrealistic for Ukraine to return to its pre-2014 borders, or Ukraine may be Russian someday. It is clearly visible that Trump just wants to end the conflict as soon as possible by any means. He seeks peace and economic stability to increase trade opportunities. To achieve this goal, he is not negotiating based on fairness or equity, but on raw power. He is putting forward bold demands, such as telling Ukraine that the US will not continue providing vital military aid for free. The US wants control over 50% of Ukraine's critical minerals. In exchange for US security support, Ukraine will have to provide rare earth minerals worth $500 billion, effectively opening the doors to its vast natural wealth for the US. Ukraine is considering this because linking its economy with the US would provide it with a security shield. However, before moving forward, Ukraine seeks security guarantees, assurances that Russia will not invade after a peace deal. Ukraine does not want any decision that compromises its sovereignty. Talking about security guarantees, if Ukraine had joined NATO, an attack on it would have been considered an attack on other NATO members under NATO's Article 5. In such a case, other NATO members would have had to come to Ukraine's defense. Article 5 emphasizes collective defense. However, Ukraine joining NATO is unlikely now because the US stance on NATO has also changed. America no longer considers Ukraine's NATO membership necessary. According to the US, this is impractical because Russia justified invading Ukraine by claiming that NATO's eastward expansion posed a security threat to it. According to Russia, the idea of including Ukraine in NATO was the provocation that led to its invasion of Ukraine. Therefore, Russia demands a guarantee that Ukraine will not join NATO. Even though America's stance may have changed, Europe remains fully committed to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. As European countries see NATO losing relevance and cracks appearing in the alliance, they are considering strengthening their own defense capabilities and reducing their dependency on the US. They aim to build a military alliance strong enough to deter Russia's future expansionism. Given the Russian threat and the uncertainty surrounding US reliability, European countries are exploring the formation of a European force separate from NATO. They are considering creating a unified European army to protect their territory. At the same time, after the US withdrew from Ukraine's security commitments, the deployment of European peacekeeping forces in Ukraine is also being discussed. Thus, based on current developments, the differences between Europe and the US regarding the peace process are becoming increasingly clear.